This is the chilling case of Leonard Grey, a man who turned his darkest fantasies into a brutal reality. In the quiet suburb of Fairwood, his obsession with a young art student named Elise Carr spiraled into one of the most disturbing investigations the town had ever seen. What began as secret photographs and shadowy surveillance ended in a hidden room, a locked trunk, and questions that remain unanswered to this day. You're about to step inside the mind of a predator, uncovering every twisted detail of his plan, and the horrifying truth behind the series he never got to finish. If you want to hear more stories like this and never miss an update, support my channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and staying active. Your engagement helps bring more real crime stories to light, and together, we can keep these dark tales from being forgotten. In the quiet suburb of Fairwood, the streets seemed frozen in time. Neighbors greeted each other in passing. The corner store still used a handwritten sign for prices, and most houses had curtains that were never drawn. Among these familiar faces was Leonard Grey, a man so unremarkable that people often forgot he was there. At 32, he worked a low-profile job at the town's printing shop, clocking in and out without fuss. He was polite, but never personal, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was ordinary. Inside his one-bedroom apartment, the truth was far from ordinary. The walls were bare except for a cluttered bookshelf and an old corkboard pinned with faded photographs of strangers. Some were candid shots from parks, bus stops, and grocery stores. Others were blurred, taken from a distance, as if the camera had been quickly lowered when someone turned around. Leonard kept stacks of notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, each page a record of observations, habits, movements, the time people came and went from their homes. He wasn't documenting friends or acquaintances. Most of these people didn't know he existed. It started harmlessly years ago, a habit born from boredom and loneliness. He would watch people from his window, imagining their lives. But over time, the harmless imagining turned darker. He didn't just wonder where they were going. He wanted to control where they ended up. He began following some of them, just to see how predictable their routines were. Then came Elise Carr. She wasn't famous, or even particularly outgoing, but something about her drew his focus. She was young, with the habit of tucking her hair behind her ear whenever she was thinking. She studied art at a nearby college and worked part-time at a small cafe. Leonard learned this without ever speaking to her. He traced her steps for weeks, noting the time she left home, the bus she took, the routes she walked when she skipped public transport. The more he observed, the more certain he became that she was meant to be part of a bigger story. His story. In his mind, it wasn't chance that brought him to her. It was fate, and he intended to make sure their paths stayed intertwined. Leonard's fixation on Elise grew into something that consumed his every waking moment. What began as casual observation evolved into a carefully constructed obsession, and soon he was spending hours each night building what he called the framework. In his journals, he outlined a sequence of events, each one designed to bring her deeper into the twisted narrative that lived in his head. It wasn't about meeting her or speaking to her. It was about capturing her, freezing her in a moment of his own creation, as though she were a character trapped in the pages of his private story. He began collecting items for what he referred to in his notes as the set. To anyone else, they were meaningless: a length of coarse rope, a heavy vintage camera with scuffed metal edges, rolls of black and white film, an old steamer trunk that smelled faintly of mildew. He scoured flea markets and second-hand stores for props, things that would give his vision a certain aesthetic. His purchases were spaced out over weeks, so no one would think to connect them. Each object was catalogued and stored with precision. In the back of his apartment, hidden behind a sliding panel he had built himself, Leonard's research extended beyond Elise's daily routine. He mapped the streets she walked, noted the dimly lit corners, the alleys that cut between buildings, the nights when foot traffic was low. He learned which shifts she worked at the cafe and when her classes ended, pinpointing moments when she would be most alone. Every detail was written in his sharp, deliberate handwriting, accompanied by sketches of the scenes he envisioned. Rainy nights appealed to him the most. The sound of water on pavement muted footsteps, and people hurried. Without noticing their surroundings, he began waiting for weather forecasts, circling the days that promised heavy showers. In his mind, the rain would be the perfect curtain, hiding his movements and dulling the world around them. The time the first week of November arrived, Leonard had decided on the moment. He would take her on a night when the streets were nearly empty, when the air was damp and cold enough to keep windows shut. To him, it wasn't just an act. It was the opening scene of the masterpiece he believed he was destined to create. Elise's absence began quietly, almost unnoticed. That Thursday night had passed without alarm. Rain had fallen steadily, and most people had stayed indoors. She had finished her shift at the cafe, smiled politely at her coworkers, and stepped out into the wet, dimly lit street. No one saw where she went after that. The following morning, her empty seat in class drew only a passing comment. Students skipped lectures all the time, and no one thought it was unusual. But by the evening, her friends grew uneasy when their calls went unanswered, and messages remained unread. When the weekend came with no word from her, concern turned into fear. Her small apartment was found locked from the outside. The bed was neatly made. Her wallet was on the counter, and her phone lay abandoned beside a mug of half-finished tea. There was no sign of forced entry, no signs of struggle. It was as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Police began knocking on doors, questioning neighbors, and checking nearby security footage. But Fairwood wasn't a city full of cameras. Most streets had none at all, and the ones that did often captured only blurry images under poor lighting. The only lead came from a grainy recording at a gas station several miles away. It showed a man in a hooded jacket loading a large, heavy object wrapped in a dark covering into the trunk of an old, rusted sedan. The license plate was obscured by mud, and the man kept his head turned away from the camera. Investigators couldn't even be certain the footage was connected to Elise, but the timing matched. Meanwhile, Leonard had quietly vanished from his job at the printing shop. No resignation, no explanation. His small apartment was dark, the curtains drawn tight. Inside, there was nothing unusual enough to raise immediate suspicion, just a man's sparse belongings and an empty bed. To neighbors, it looked as though he had gone on a trip. To investigators, it was a dead end. Still, somewhere in the shadows of Fairwood, Elise's absence was not an accident. She had become part of something carefully planned, and time was running out to find her. 2 weeks after Elise vanished, the investigation had stalled. Leads were drying up, and the search radius had been expanded beyond Fairwood. It was a maintenance worker who finally broke the silence. Sent to repair a leaking pipe in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, he noticed water pooling near a locked storage room. The door was old but reinforced with the heavy padlock that didn't match the building's original fittings. Suspicious, he contacted the property owner, who then alerted the police. When officers forced the lock open, the air inside hit them with a stench so thick it clung to their clothes. The room was dim, lit only by a single bulb dangling from a wire. Every wall was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned in precise rows. Each image featured Elise walking to class, sitting at the cafe, browsing at the bookstore, even looking out her apartment window. Many had been taken from angles that suggested she had been followed closely for months. In the center of the room sat the old steamer trunk Leonard had acquired, its brass latches tarnished and its surface streaked with grime. It was locked, but the hinges gave way under the force of a crowbar. Inside was Elise's body, positioned with deliberate care, her hands folded and her head tilted as though part of a posed scene. Around her were scattered objects: a broken paintbrush, dried flowers, a small frame containing a photograph of her taken long before she disappeared. Near the trunk was Leonard's vintage camera, still loaded with undeveloped film. On a nearby table lay a series of numbered cards, each neatly printed and placed in order. Elise's card bore the number 4. There were no other bodies in the room, but the implication was chilling. This was not his first victim. Investigators carefully collected every photograph, journal, and prop. The level of planning and attention to detail spoke of someone who had treated the crime as a project, a creation. Leonard had turned the room into a twisted gallery, and Elise was its centerpiece. The unanswered question remained: who were numbers 1, 2, and 3, and where could they be? The discovery in the warehouse sparked a manhunt unlike anything Fairwood had ever seen. Leonard Grey's name and photograph were plastered across news broadcasts and shared endlessly online. His face became the subject of fear and fascination. The image of a man no one had really noticed until it was far too late. Police believed he was still in the area, but every reported sighting dissolved into nothing. For weeks, it seemed as if Leonard had vanished into thin air. Then, a month after the warehouse search, a fisherman on the River Hallow spotted something drifting in the water. At first, he thought it was debris tangled in reeds, but as his boat drew closer, the shape became unmistakable. It was a body, pale and bloated from days in the current. The clothes matched the description given in the missing suspect alert. When authorities pulled it to shore, they confirmed it was Leonard. His death was ruled a drowning, though whether it was intentional or the result of an escape gone wrong was never determined. Inside his waterlogged coat pockets, investigators found a collection of small, sealed envelopes. Each contained a photograph of a different woman, none of them Elise. On the back of each photo was a number, written in the same precise handwriting seen on the card found beside Elise's body. Some numbers matched the missing gaps in the sequence, while others suggested there were even more intended victims. The photographs were circulated nationally in hopes of identifying the women. A few came forward alive and unharmed, having never realized they were being watched. Others were never found. The case became more unsettling with every lead that went nowhere, leaving open the possibility that Leonard had already completed parts of his series without detection. In the months that followed, the story of Leonard Grey faded from the headlines, but in Fairwood, the unease lingered. People who once left their doors unlocked began checking them twice. Strangers on the street were met with suspicion. The warehouse was eventually torn down, but those who had seen the photographs inside would never forget them. Leonard's twisted fantasies had ended, but the mystery of his earlier victims remained a shadow the town could not shake.